This event is the launch of a paper we wrote a few months ago now. And we had support from the AFD, which is the Alliance Française de Développement. And we also worked on this paper together with the Presidential Climate Commission. So the authors are myself, Dr. Kwesi Mabasa, and Katrina Lingruber. Katrina is online today. And the topic of the paper is the political economy of social ownership in South Africa, opportunities to address inequality in transition. And I'm really excited about this paper because I think it brings up the social issues within the just transition really starkly. And we tried to take a kind of broader view on not just looking at energy in this kind of conversation around just transition and energy transfer in South Africa, but actually looking across sectors, because that is what a transition should be if we're aiming to kind of reduce emissions significantly. And so I want to quickly introduce our panelists today. And so to start, Kwesi, myself, and Katrina will present the paper. And then we have some wonderful panelists who've agreed to speak. So the first panelist is Tanya van Mielis from COSATU. She's the Labour Market Policy Coordinator in COSATU and the head of the policy unit. We also have Mr. Devendra Pillay, also known as Devon, from the Presidential Climate Commission. He's the institutional support, he leads the institutional support unit, which draws on evidence-based research, mobilizes stakeholders and partners to realize the just transition by catalyzing projects and programs to diversify local economies, expand and grow industrial capabilities, and initiate and develop livelihood activities. He also has many years of experience in the public sector, in research. I don't have time to go through his whole bio. I hope you don't mind, Devon. We really appreciate you and that you're here today. And then we have Ruth Benbu, who's a community development practitioner. She's focused on community development and interested in cooperatives as a tool for organizing communities and organizing community assets for building sustainable access to goods and services. She's also the founder and executive director of the Institute for Cooperatives and Community Economic Development. She's also been a member of parliament for 17 years, and she was the deputy mayor of Ubud District Municipality for 3 years. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand over to Kwesi to get us started on the presentation. Thank you so much. Sorry, that's incorrect. We first have our wonderful funder, AFD, for giving an introduction. I'm so sorry, Anda. Thank you so much for joining online. I know you're not probably in this time zone, but yeah, please go ahead and share the introduction. Thank you.
No worries. I said because I left South Africa, you already forgot me, so I'm trying not to take it personally. No, thank you so much for this, and well, a big thank you for inviting me to the webinar, but more importantly, thank you for this excellent collaboration that we had with SCIS and WITS. And as you know, AFD, which is the French Development Bank, has been quite dedicated in supporting the just dimension of the transition. And this has actually infused from research to technical cooperation and then to concessional financing. And our approach is not to push for an energy transition at all costs, but rather support our partners in investing into a more sustainable future, and sustainable from both an environmental perspective, but also, and not just as an add-on or as an externality, from a social perspective. And today's levels of inequality that we see are not sustainable, and especially not in South Africa. So for the country, our approach was to actually seeing things as coming down to to shaping a just, equitable, and more low carbon society, and trying to see what we can support on this ambition. But it also implies that the extractive and highly unequal model on which the current economy has been built needs to change towards a economic and industrial model that is less concentrated and more diversified, not only in terms of energy, but also more diversified in terms of ownership of capital. And the first time we spoke about the idea of this project was while having coffee with Steve Nichols and complaining on how actually the transition will not be just if it doesn't involve a transfer of capital from the richest to the most vulnerable. And as you also mentioned, very often in the discussions on how to empower communities, for instance, the solution has almost always been community-owned renewables. And we actually think that this issue of ownership and who owns the capital that is needed, that is invested in the transition, needs to go much more beyond new renewables and much more beyond community ownership. So thank you again to the WITS colleagues and to the PCC colleagues who agreed to work with us and think a bit outside the box on what does it mean to change forms of ownership, to see what other alternatives to private ownership there are, which can include public ones, but also employee-owned schemes, or of course the community ownership. So thank you again. I hope that that the paper will sort of create ripples, and that the discussion on the topic will continue beyond our small project. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Anda. Lizzie, up to you.
Right. So afternoon, colleagues, comrades. Let me also start off by just thanking our colleagues from SCIS for hosting this discussion. My personal sort of interaction with social ownership is influenced by both, I think, political experience, but also some policy debates. When I worked at COSATU a couple of years ago, I once visited a factory in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, that was actually run by workers, a steel one. And in 2020, myself and Ayabo Matawe, under the leadership of an institute called MISTRA in South Africa, had an interesting debate when we had a book on rethinking BEE, on chapters that specifically look at trade union ownership in the economy, looking at the investment arms and ESOPs. And I think you will find that these experiences come out in different parts of the paper. I mean, the first thing to say, I think it's well established that South Africa has a structural inequality problem. And this inequality problem is intersectional. It's related to race, class, gender, and even as geographic dimensions. And this is quite interesting or intriguing because we know that South Africa has had quite extensive social redistribution policies to try and address this problem of inequality. There are grants, low-fee schools, you could even argue employment equity, BEE, ESOPs. But even in the context of these forms of social redistribution, this inequality persists, and it's one of the highest forms of inequality in the world. And when one looks at most of the policy solutions that are designed to address this intersectional inequality, they mostly have to do with debates around labor income, so increasing wages, social transfers, even arguments about improving the skills of residents or citizens in society so that they become more employable. And all these solutions have existed also for some time. And we know we've had the implementation of the minimum wage. There are debates about extending even the social transfers. But evidently, they haven't been sufficient. And the point that we're trying to make in this context is that these solutions are mostly based on labor market interventions or social policy. And they hardly focus on the question of ownership. And this is what then interested us in this topic. But also, if we move from the premise that capitalism isn't going to create this idea of full employment, and not everyone will be absorbed into wage employment, then obviously we have to consider a multiplicity of livelihoods. And this is where even the discussion of social ownership comes in. And this is why then we wanted to connect this idea of ownership to inequality, to sort of explore whether alternative forms of ownership can help us address inequality beyond the existing policy measures that I've just mentioned. But we also wanted to engage the debates in South Africa on redistributive politics, which mostly, as I said, focuses on labor market issues, income, the social wage, but in my view, doesn't interrogate this question of ownership sufficiently. And I think this is a shortcoming that needs to be addressed. And now I'm going to go speak politically on the left, both within and outside the academy. And so obviously the concept of social ownership is quite contested, right? There are different interpretations of social ownership historically, both theoretically, but also in practice. But the main thing that comes out across in all definitions of social ownership is the idea that it's not individual ownership, it's a collective form of ownership that sort of questions the conventional capitalist notion of private property. And there are different forms of social ownership that have existed throughout history, right? So you're looking at trade union-run factories, community cooperatives, public ownership as well. And that point is made throughout the paper. So within this complexity of trying to define and conceptualize social ownership, in all the literature sources that we engage in, we sort of came to four main characteristics of what constitutes social ownership in all this literature. The first one is that social ownership refers to collective ownership, right? So it's different from conventional capitalist private property rights framework, and that this collective form of ownership can take different forms, and we outlined it in the paper. The second element that we sort of highlight to tenants is that socially owned enterprises or organizations are not primarily based on seeking profit, okay, or returns on investment. The main aim is to pursue public interest and social returns. And some of the social returns that we highlight in the paper relate to access to public goods, decreasing inequality, addressing the ecological crisis, and even transforming economic structures. The third tenet or characteristic that we highlight of social ownership in the paper is the idea of democratic control in decision-making and governance. So in other words, in these organizations, there is bottom-up decision-making, right? And this decision-making isn't over just governance and ownership issues, but in some cases, it also involves decision over the operations of these socially owned entities. And this is one of the most contentious issues in the literature because it can take different forms, both direct and indirect. And the last element that we try to highlight in the paper is that socially owned entities are based on a concept of solidaristic economic relations. Right? So in other words, there's an element in these organizations that questions this thinking around developing competition amongst different economic actors in a society or in an economy. And this is why if you encounter the literature on social ownership, a lot of it refers to the idea of the solidarity economy, examples and models. So those are the four characteristics that we came to when engaging the literature. So obviously this concept is not new, and we make this point in the paper that the debate on social ownership is not a 21st century debate. It predates the 21st century. And what we then try to do in the paper is to historicize it in a political economy context, and to sort of highlight what are the main influences that have shaped social ownership since the 19th century. The first one, of course, is socialist thinking and the idea of social ownership in that context, and looking at socialist experiments in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. and even the second one is the emergence of social democratic states and their different forms of what you call minimalistic social ownership. And more recently, debates about heterodox development models, which include the solidarity economy, eco-socialism, the well-being economy, the donut economy, and other influences, right? Which question the idea of how we understand ownership in our societal context. And so I think it's always important to take this history into account, because we must always sort of assess modern forms of social ownership on the backdrop of this historical context. And in the African context, there's some interesting examples. As we know, the African socialist experiments that were largely influenced not only by materialist conception of socialism, but also the principle of communalism. And here I'm looking at the examples of Nkrumah, Nyerere, and others. And then the other aspect that we sort of highlight in the paper is the role of the state. And this is important because when people often discuss the failures or the successes of socially owned models, or cooperatives, community enterprises, trade union factories, they always argue that these models have failed because they're uncompetitive, right? Or they can't compete. Okay. The second argument is that people don't have the adequate management skills and financial management skills. Okay. And also this idea of decentralized decision making is inefficient. See? And you can hear that all these criticisms are based on key neoliberal, I would argue, assumptions. And so what we try to do in the paper is to actually look at the relationship between the success of socially owned model and the role of the states, and what assumptions inform the role of the states in either supporting or creating a particular policy environment for these socially owned models. And I think this is an important point to make, because often people forget the structural impediments that stop these models from being sustainable, right? So for example, if you have concentrated economic sectors and you're expecting these models to be successful, you're setting them up for failure. If you're not giving them the adequate support in terms of subsidies, industrial protections, and the others, they're going to fail. So then we came to sort of an approach or in relation to the states in socially owned. We came to an approach in relation to the role of the state in supporting social ownership that is based on three different approaches. The first one is basically the typical, what I would call, regulatory state approach when it comes to supporting socially owned enterprises, where basically the states view these enterprises as organizations that are mainly there to just alleviate poverty and sometimes even take over state roles, right? And facilitate the retreat from the state of providing public goods. That's where you get this logic of the communities that must help themselves and the whole self-help logic, okay? And sort of this first paradigm of the state's role in social ownership supports neoliberalism in several ways, because it doesn't really question the underlying economic relations and logic of the capitalist system or a market-based economy. And in some cases, as I said, it actually supports deepened privatization and the idea of the state actually withdrawing from providing key public services and mechanisms of support. The second one is where there is an acknowledgement of the state in supporting socially owned enterprises, right? And in this form, the support of the role of the state in supporting social ownership is public ownership, industrial policy, the state having extensive competition policy as well. And you find this mostly with examples in the 20th century, the developmental states and some social democratic states. So in this context, there's an acknowledgement that the state should play a role in developing, an extensive role, in developing different forms of social ownership, either directly or indirectly. And then I think there's a third or more radical approach, which is what we term as a transformative role of the state in social ownership. And there are some interesting points to be made about this approach. The first one is that this approach is based on alternative models. So, i.e., questions capitalist relations, it questions neoliberalism and the principle and the policy prescripts that come with it. The second thing is that in this third transformative approach, it is not necessarily statist. So, in other words, when people think about the idea of social ownership, most of the time, they think about the idea of some state authority exercising ultimate control, right? And so in this third approach, it's not necessarily statist and looks at different forms of social ownership that require state support but are not always led by the state. And of course, this is understandable in light of the criticisms against 20th century socialism and the emphasis on statist models of development. And the third thing that's interesting about this transformative approach is that it draws both on experiences from the global north and the global south as well. And these experiences are not only lessons that you can draw about how to organize the economies from a material perspective, but there are also cultural, social norms that we learn up that also should influence how we rethink economic development. And then in terms of South Africa, these are some of the experiences of social ownership that we've had. Before I end off, I just want to make two crucial points, right? The one is related to the debate about cooperatives, right? And people argue that, we can't really pursue this idea of cooperatives. They're going to fail. There's too much governance problems, corruption, and they just, they can't compete. But if one looks at the history of South Africa's political economy and the development of cooperatives, especially in the 20th century, what we see is that the success of the cooperatives wasn't based only on the internal functioning of these entities. It emerged on the back of extensive state support in the form of subsidies, trade policy, even creating demand in some cases, especially if one looks at the history of the agricultural sector. So there's something to be said about the way that we think about the successes and the failures of cooperatives in relation to what I said earlier about the role of the state. The second thing that I want to mention before I end up is around this issue about employee share ownership schemes. Now, these have been presented as one of the possible solutions for addressing South Africa's questions around redistribution and building a more inclusive economy. And the DTI recently published a study that said about close to 500,000 workers have been involved in ESOPs. Now, I just want to speak about an interesting story or a piece of evidence that came out of our BE book. So one of the highest paying ESOPs was the Kumba Iron ESOP, right? That when the deal was concluded in 2012 or 2011 and 12. And the workers basically received 500,000 each, okay? But the interesting thing is that after the workers received the money, they went on strike. And there was big commotion, right? And this was sort of like interesting because people were like, no, but this doesn't make sense. These companies have got 500,000, what's the problem? But then the issue is some of the reasons are telling, and they relate to this critique of like social ownership and how we think about it in relation to the structure of the political economy. The first one is that the workers thought that the payout would come with more control over the company. And that didn't really happen, right? So this speaks to the idea of democratic control that I spoke about. The second thing is that the ESOP basically was an ESOP that only included permanent workers. And as we know, the structure of mining, precarious work has become more prominent, right? So it excluded large groups of workers. So there was second reason, right? And then the third reason is that the workers also never understood that also when people get dividends or shares in company, they are determined by financial factors that are outside of their control, such as share price movements and other things. And I think this is telling because this piece of evidence highlights that when we think about social ownership and the successes and the failures, we cannot divorce it from these sort of broader macroeconomic policy and political economy factors that I'm trying to speak to. I'll now hand over to Julia to carry on with the presentation.
Yeah, I guess the last point on the slide is that, public ownership, technically, if you kind of remove context and reality, should be classified as social ownership because it kind of meets the four features that we described earlier: collective ownership, public benefit, democratic control and decision-making, and solidarity. But I think the problem really comes in when there isn't democratic control and decision-making, and there isn't transparency and accountability. And so that's why there is, currently a lot of contestation around the role of the state in South Africa at the moment. And people are hesitant to say that the state is going to be the actor kind of who changes the game, who addresses inequality because of the kind of politics behind it. Okay, I'm just going to. So we've then kind of delineated some key mechanisms through which social ownership reduces inequality. This is theoretical. We did find examples of this in the case studies that we looked at in the paper. But I'm just going to go through some of them briefly. So the first point is that shared ownership supports redistribution and the concentration of wealth. And that's because, we have colleagues, we at the Inequality Center, we spend a lot of time looking at inequality, whether it's income inequality, wealth inequality, inequality in access to services, etc. And ownership is a key issue within broader structures and structural inequality in South Africa. And so kind of moving to a model where ownership is more shared, where it's less kind of concentrated, is inherently redistributive. And it also means that, in a corporate model, the owners of the entity are more likely to increase income over time in comparison to workers. And so it also addresses kind of the power differential within an entity by increasing the kind of ability to engage in ownership decisions in a shared ownership model. And similarly, social ownership can therefore reduce exploitation. If there is, because social ownership has public benefit at its core, because it's central to the idea is democratic decision making, there should be less exploitation in the experience. And we have found in our case studies that that is one of the kind of positives that has emerged in some of our cases. I'm going to just kind of quickly go through. So I think I've made the point about public benefit reducing inequality. We also want to emphasize that inequality at the national scale can be reduced by poverty reduction or increasing incomes of lower income populations, which social ownership promotes. Often social ownership is kind of at a cooperative level, and one of the aims in terms of public benefit is to reduce poverty. And to look at kind of broader issues of inequality, if we're reducing poverty, that means we're also going to be reducing inequality nationally. And lastly, a really interesting aspect which kind of emerged from our expert interviews and case studies is that maintaining resources and money in the places where they're created, rather than being extracted for profit elsewhere, can support local cohesion and equity. And that's linked to, I guess, an idea that social ownership is more local. The current models that we've looked at mean that the collective ownership is that people who are using the entity or benefiting from the entity or members of the entity are also the owners. And so the owners can't be kind of in Sweden or Switzerland and still be the beneficiaries and involved in the running of the entity. So I think that kind of shifts the power and shifts where the returns also go. Okay, so then to go into our case studies. So yeah, just to kind of a brief note on methodology, we've conducted various interviews for this paper, and we conducted 4 case studies. We selected the case studies so that they were a mixture of rural and urban cases. We also wanted to find case studies across different sectors. So the first case study that we looked at was a municipally owned microgrid, solar microgrid. And this is one of the first solar microgrids in a South African informal settlement, where the microgrid was installed and funded through the provincial grant, and it provides electricity to 200 homes and 500 people. So the community benefits are that it's safe, reliable electricity to people who previously didn't have grid access. It's reduced illegal connections and associated risks. It's also supported job opportunities for local residents and SMEs. The governance of the solar microgrid is that the city utility owns and operates the microgrid. But local residents have had a strong role in construction, involvement in ongoing operations. And unfortunately, involvement in ongoing operations has kind of dwindled a little bit. And so that's one of the concerns when you hand over to a city power, which in this case, city power, you kind of sometimes lose some of the local ownership and decision making. But there was a huge focus in the construction of the solar microgrid to include the local community. However, challenges with this model mean that you're kind of dependent on grants to set up a microgrid. Often there's a high capital cost initially when there's a solar power plant, even microgrids. And so there's a question about that, whether that's can be an ongoing option for financing. Also, residents haven't necessarily benefited from reduced electricity prices, even though, so city power is actually benefiting because the price they're paying for that electricity is much lower than what they're paying Eskom. But unfortunately, well, there is a regulation through NERSA that requires that all South Africans pay the same amount, the same fee, even if it's coming from a solar microgrid that is lower cost in your area. So there's also a bit of a question around policy there on pricing. I'll hand over to Katrina to carry on with the case studies. Katrina, I'll control your slides, so just let me know when you want to change.
Thanks so much, Julia. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. Our second case study consisted actually of two relatively small agricultural cooperatives in the rural Eastern Cape. Both of them acted as secondary co-ops, so they're kind of umbrella co-ops with several underneath them, and that structure helps to kind of pool resources and pool governance structures. And both of these co-ops had quite long histories going back to the Ciskei government in the area, but had kind of periods of dormancy or kind of where they were struggling a lot and periods of relatively more success. So the one was about 150 hectares of mainly vegetable crop farming, and they were receiving quite a lot of state support through the Farm Production Support Unit, whereas the other one was a dairy farming co-op, and the co-op was in partnership with kind of a private company, and they were kind of, the co-op provided land and some of the cattle, and then the company provided some of the capital investment, and they kind of split profits. So although they were structured quite differently, kind of our findings show that they had relatively similar positive impacts in terms of kind of contributing towards cohesion in the community, reducing poverty for some of its members, helping create local employment. That was really important, that all of them emphasized kind of when they had jobs to give out, it was really important that they came from the local community, provide access to essential resources like land and water, and even in the one case promote climate adaptation. In both cases, the co-ops have received quite significant state support at different times and in different forms. So whether that's the provision of land, water infrastructure, training, and also financial support. And yet they still face quite a lot of barriers for success. So the big one that both of them flagged was limited market access. So kind of getting their products to markets further away, but also aging and inadequate infrastructure, particularly water infrastructure, which is really important for both crop and dairy farming, issue of droughts, and then limited land as kind of the communities got bigger. Next slide, please. The third case study looked at a union-established nonprofit organization, which was partly funded by the union's investment company. And so the NPO was established to support retrenched mine workers with community-led livelihoods. So looking at different socioeconomic development programs, enterprise development, skills training, those kinds of projects. And it benefits a large number of people, an estimated 20,000 people per year. And so the state does support this NPO, mainly through kind of partnering with it, but also providing things like technical assistance. But they did critique the state for kind of the insufficient financial support that social ownership initiatives are given more broadly in South Africa. And because of their status as an NPO and kind of their limited financial constraints, they were really heavily reliant on partnerships with other actors, which also limited their own capacity to kind of achieve the objectives that they set out, and experiment with kind of different models. Next slide, please. And then the last study was a financial cooperative in the Western Cape. It had about 360 members, and was mostly focused on providing savings products, but also hoped to kind of extend into lending products, but was facing some kind of regulatory issues with that. Interestingly, this COP actually saw its main benefit as kind of solidarity and bringing people in the small community together. It also hoped to assist members in achieving some kind of financial independence, reducing their banking fees by not having to go to big banks, and also promoting social inclusion by providing kind of financial support to members who otherwise wouldn't have been able to access kind of financial institutions. But they were really struggling to actually achieve these kind of higher order goals. And this was largely due to the high regulatory burdens. So financial cooperatives have quite a lot of requirements that they have to meet in terms of compliance, which kind of one can understand. But like some of the other co-ops, also faced issues around governance, kind of high board turnover, capacity of the board. Although they received quite a lot of technical support from the state in terms of achieving the necessary compliance levels, they also advocated for more partnerships with government in terms of strengthening these cooperatives. Next slide, please. So I think that kind of we've touched on the case studies quite quickly, but I think they give a sense of the kind of diversity of social ownership models that exist in South Africa in different sectors and different parts of the country, and also different types. Just to conclude, kind of we've argued in this paper that the key characteristics of social ownership include collective ownership structure, the pursuit of public benefit, democratic control and decision making, and an ethic of cooperation and solidarity. And these principles are not only important kind of in their own right, but they also contribute to the positive returns that these projects can bring. So increasing local employment, improved access to public goods or kind of essential goods, skills development, and providing some kind of social security. It can also assist to decrease the concentration of wealth in the economy, decrease undemocratic and exploitative labor practices and relations, and allows kind of basic necessities to circulate within communities, rather than kind of money being kind of leaving communities where it's, and value being leaving communities from where it's produced. So although the kind of idea of social ownership has gotten a lot of attention in the context of the just transition, these models really aren't new. And what can we learn from the rich history and existing experience of social ownership models? And I think it's something that Kwesi highlighted, but it's really important to acknowledge that it's difficult for these models to exist in the existing macroeconomic framework. Social ownership almost everywhere in the world and all these models has kind of came as an alternative to capitalist models of exploitation and production. And so for these models to succeed and be integrated into a broadly capitalist system is really hard. And yet, despite the numerous difficulties that our cases show, they've actually shown remarkable longevity over sometimes kind of more than 30 years, despite some of these financial challenges. And they've persisted because of the financial returns and because of the social returns and social benefits that they bring to their members. And so we'd highlight that these should also be an important indicator of success, kind of the social and public benefit. And this is largely due to kind of the organizational cultures that rest on participatory and bottom-up decision-making. So I'll close there. Thank you everyone for listening, and we really look forward to engaging with you all and hearing from our discussants. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Katrina. We're now going to hear some reflections from our panelists. I think we'll start with Ruth online, if you're there, Ruth. Oh dear, we lost Ruth. Okay. Sorry, then I think we'll move to Deb. Oh, there's Ruth. She's on my screen, but not on that screen. Ruth, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. If you could turn your camera on again, and please proceed with your feedback.
Yes, the line is bad, but I can then make my contribution. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that this provides us with an opportunity to engage and also to facilitate transformation even in the economy. My input is that the political economy of social ownership in South Africa does provide opportunities to address inequality in transition. I agree with that. I also agree with a number of issues that have been raised, like cooperatives not getting enough support and not becoming a catalyst for transformation of the economy to include ownership by communities. I would want to start by saying that the difficulties in South Africa for cooperatives to play the role they are supposed to be playing is that the whole process is driven by government. The process of developing cooperatives is driven by government, and it is more about providing grants than transforming the economy to include ownership by communities. So the government in South Africa is pushing this, but has adopted a very narrow perspective of what cooperatives are and what social economy is. Social economy is a very powerful tool that facilitates active participation of communities in their development and also in ownership of the economy. So the just transition should be based on the following principles. One, building South Africa into a developmental state. Currently, there are two systems in South Africa. There is a developmental state for the private sector, and then there is a welfare state for communities. If government can then honor and say, we are building a developmental state, and a developmental state means that the environment is friendly for South Africa to have a mixed economic system that is driven by the three pillars, which would be the state-owned enterprises, like Eskom, if we talk about energy, and local municipalities own energy production and distribution, by the private sector, another pillar, and community or worker-owned enterprises in a form of cooperative. Currently, South Africa is not moving towards becoming a mixed economic system. Government is favoring the private sector. The third principle should be building sustainable communities. The fourth one, growing an inclusive economy where wealth would trickle down. The fifth one would be poverty eradication and reduce overdependency of poor families on government handouts. And then the seventh one is to shift away from thinking that communities should only participate in the economy as providers of labor and consumers of goods and services. Now, if we can move from that premise and also include the fact that when we do that, we would be promoting the asset-based community development, which means the assets that are found in communities are actually used. The communities are enabled in terms of skills to use the assets that are found in those communities for the benefit of the communities. So the issue then of access to market, I agree with the researchers that that is the perception that the social economy doesn't have access to market. But that is a perception based on the belief that Spar is a market, Checkers is a market, the spaza shop is a market, whereas the actual market is the consumer. So if the consumer is not organized to provide through a social enterprise, the consumer would always, those who control the market, who own the means of production, who control and own the economy, would then make the consumer to believe that the market is Spar, whereas the actual market is the consumer. It's the people who are actually using the goods and services. And they lack a better understanding, and also they lack capacity to organize themselves so that they can provide themselves with the goods and services that are used by them. The last point that I want to make is that there are laws in this country that have been passed, but I don't think that we have the same understanding and interpretation of those laws. I'm just going to quote two of them, which would have opened a huge opportunity for the social economy. The first one is Act number 84, the South African Schools Act, Act number 84 of 1996. I'll just focus on Section 21. Section 21 provides the school governing bodies, empowers the school governing bodies to register the schools as Section 21. Why should they do that? So that the power to govern all the resources that are provided by government to the schools are actually governed by the school governing board. And the school governing body is a body that represents the local people, the educators, and the learners. If you read that with Act number 14, the Cooperatives Act number 14 of 2005, which then provides for the establishment of a primary cooperative by a minimum of 5 natural persons, 2 by a minimum of 2 juristic persons, meaning 2 schools now. And then the third option is a combination of the 2. What would have happened if the school governing bodies would have applied Section 21 of Act number 84 of 1996 and the Cooperatives Act number 14 of 2005, and then register the schools as Section 21 and then establish enterprises that are owned by the schools as cooperatives to produce their own stationery, to supply their own food to the school nutrition program, to control the scholar transport, and make sure that it's the school cooperative that is running that scholar transport, to manufacture their school uniforms. This is the enterprise now owned by the school, to manufacture their own school furniture. And why would this be important? it is important because a social enterprise is more concerned, has a concern for the community. So the surplus that would be generated from that would be plowed back to provide other services in the community to make the community self-reliant and self-sufficient and provide itself with the jobs. So one of the shortcomings in South Africa is the expectation that government has to do everything for the communities. And also it is the failure to unpack the existing policies in a manner that would provide social economy opportunities to participate and become self-reliant and build resilient communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Yeah, really interesting inputs and good to learn about the different acts that are relevant to this story as well. Okay, I'll hand over to Devin to give your feedback.
Thanks, Julia. And just a quick hello and thank you to ANDA and AFD for funding the paper. I'm just going to dive straight into it. I just see we might be running out of time. So principally, I kind of agree largely with the paper in terms of the benefits of social ownership, its structure, its composition. And I think what we want to see through ownership is very, very important. We want to reverse the tide of chronic unemployment, deep poverty, inequality. And, this is, it's for the past 30 years, at the dawn of democracy, we envisage a significant level of transformation taking place. In the late 1990s, I think GEAR, unfortunately, started to a process that deeply embedded capital into the ecosystem and prevented the development to a large extent of socially owned initiatives and projects. Now, the outcomes of GEAR, or the envisaged outcomes of GEAR, and it's not unexpected, did not materialize. We continue with chronic unemployment. We continue with deep poverty, inequality, and a concentration of wealth. The supply side measures that was introduced at the time also failed to address some of these challenges. And we've had issues around massive volumes of money being spent on skills development, on MSME development, with the thinking that these will contribute towards the growth of the economy. And we failed in this regard. And the large reason for why the failure exists is around markets. There is no markets to absorb the thousands that have been trained through the skills development programs, both through SETAs and through private entities, as well as through academic institutions. There was insufficient markets to absorb large numbers of MSMEs into the value chains. And this is where I tend to agree with Ruth. When we think through the economy and what needs to happen around addressing some of these socioeconomic challenges, it needs to be deeply embedded within society. And in this regard, the social ownership paper speaks volumes to issues about democratization of decision-making, the benefits to society, the benefits to the economy. And if we build in social ownership, which essentially is a means of production that is owned and controlled by society. And when we speak about society, it could be either worker-owned, community-owned, or state-owned that benefits the members of society. And if we're able to think this through more coherently and more cohesively, we'll be able to choreograph or sequence events that lead to a big impact. Now, when you speak about promoting collective control, this goes beyond as the private sector and large corporates think things this through. Profit is the main key and main driver of decisions that are taken by these entities. But when you look at social ownership, surplus/profit is not the only factor that drives decision making. Issues around labor practices, issues around environment, issues around health play a very critical, important role in these decision-making structures, and therefore become more useful and more meaningful in terms of economic activity, as well as building out social solidarity. For us to address these triple challenges, which have remained stubborn, you need to have social ownership that is focused on pro-poor and pro-people programs, that leads to the development of society as a whole. And this is the distinguishing factor, I think, in the PCC's definition of social ownership. It is centered around the poor in society. It is also people-driven. And what that means is that it's a whole new take and understanding of how we build this out. The one point that I think I need to we need to have some sort of discussion on is understanding the social benefits of socially owned initiatives and the issue of profit. Because I believe profit is critically important. Whether you call it profit or whether you call it surplus, it's critically important. Because what you want to do is establish an entity that is able to sustain itself on a long term, that's able to derive benefits, and that is able to grow. Growth is linked to R&D. So if you don't have surplus/profits for R&D and for growth, you're bound to stagnate, become uncompetitive in the market, and then begin to dwindle. So you want to create social ownership structures that are flexible to the extent that they're able to adapt and respond to what I would consider markets. And markets does not necessarily mean private sector markets, but market means those that are willing to buy products. And this could be largely from communities. And a lot of the social ownership models that we think through, demand is locally based. And that's a driving factor behind them, and that's a driving success. And the surplus from that then feeds into other markets, whether it's beyond the local market, it could be national, it could be provincial, but it also could be global. So in thinking through these structures, and the governance around this, it's very important to build in some of these efficiencies that will lead to sustained long-term entities that are able to realize both, social benefits and social programs that benefit society as a whole. The add-on to this is you're able to distribute income and improve income distribution to a larger numbers of people, number quantums. You're able to improve public good. Decisions are made, as the paper correctly points, democratically. And it goes beyond, these decisions that go beyond just market exploitation issues around bad or poor labor practices. It goes towards issues around, creating an enabling environment that could possibly even see what we now consider the informal sector being absorbed into the mainstream economy. So for me, social ownership has multiple layers of benefits. It's able to restructure the entire economy. It's able to address issues of unemployment. It's able to address issues of poverty, inequality, and begin to generally transform our mainstream economy by absorbing large numbers of those that are active in the informal sector. I'm going to pause at that point and allow for further inputs and then discussions around this. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks so much. So you want to sit here, stand here, or sit?
So thanks very much for inviting Cosatu to come and speak at the seminar. It's really important, the work that you do. And it's really important that we keep linking progressive academics with progressive formations. As the labour movement, we worked before with SCIS, we have old comrades from us, to develop our own ideas. But equally, as your academic research and rigour helps us inform our own ideas, we hope that you're engaging us and just getting in touch with more concerns from the ground and what's happening helps inform your case studies and your rigour maybe going forward. So to say this kind of thing is most welcome and should keep continuing. The paper is really, really interesting. And for me, one of the successes of a paper is that it raises more questions than it answers. So in fact, I was chatting to Kwesi earlier on, and I was saying, I haven't thought through how complex defining social ownership is. And I've worked on the social economy for years and years when I was in government in DTRC. But you raise a number of key questions, and I think those are the questions we need to debate. I prefer, instead of saying that there are 4 components as you do, and say you either yes or not in terms of social ownership, I think it's easier to think of it along a continuum. So in some senses, for example, are ESOPs, and it's raised in the paper, is an ESOP of social ownership or not? It's questioned in terms of the limitations of democratic control, for example. If one thinks in terms of a spectrum, instead of throwing some forms of social ownership out, I think it allows more space to say how, where there is some kind of social ownership on any of the criteria, can we strengthen it? Because we know what we want social ownership to do. We want social ownership to increase the income and assets of workers and members of the community more broadly. We want social ownership to increase democracy, be it how you're engaging on the shop floor or within your organizations, or how you're engaging and contesting the power of the multinationals. We know the economy is highly concentrated. The more smaller businesses there are and medium-sized businesses, the more forms of alternate ownership there are, the more one is able to contest high levels of concentration in an economy. Critical for me is state ownership, and that was raised in the paper. There are problems. In many cases, SOEs are given a profit mandate. That can't knock them out of social ownership. They're key institutions in our democracy. That's what many of us fought, many people died for. So the question then is not do we discard it, but to say how do we institute stronger forms of democratic control over our public entities to make sure they're meeting public and social need. I found it fascinating in the case studies. In the case studies, I think the depth and the granularity that you looked at is great. So looking at the microgrid, for example, shows there had been an increase in employment, but electricity prices didn't fall, largely because of regulations. But I think the challenge for us, we want to see more social ownership and the existing social ownership expanded dramatically, is how do we build a case then for more social ownership and ensuring communities benefit? Because what detractors could easily say is they could say, well, that's why we must have PPPs. PPPs, you don't need community ownership. Have PPPs. They'll increase employment exactly like you did. They'll increase profits, and that can be plowed back into the community. And that's the challenge I throw at you. Is the research is good? Go deeper, make it better. Help make the case of why we want social ownership and not necessarily private ownership on the practicalities of those examples. I want to throw a challenge to you, because the paper is looking at the political economy. And my question to you is if social ownership doesn't receive huge amounts of funding from government, which is essential, if it doesn't have the support of a regulatory environment, are we actually transforming the economy? Or are we legitimate an existing neoliberal structure? It's the same thing. You can go to any big corporation. They can be making profits or dirty fuels and super exploitation. And they'll say, no, don't worry. We spend X% of turnover on CSR. And we built 2 schools and we fund 3 clinics. And they use that as a way to legitimate what they're doing and to gain a social license. I think, unless we radically ramp up social ownership to transform power relations, because that's what it's about, we risk the danger of using current social ownership to legitimate a neoliberal structure where capital remains hugely dominant and where resources continue to flow to those very concentrated economies and businesses. The other trend that I think is coming through that we need to keep an eye on is the issue around state ownership. State ownership is fundamental to social ownership. It is the easiest and best way to make sure that we have institutions that are democratically controlled, that serve the interests of people, not profit. So it's important to push for worker cooperatives and all different forms of cooperatives. We must keep doing it. But equally important, we must stop a push towards privatization or a push towards hollowing out the state, which is the biggest form of public ownership that we have now. Where it's not working, and in many cases, it's not working. Look at Tembisa. You can look at corruption and a range of things. The answer is not to say that this social ownership or form of ownership is failed, but how do we make it better? It's not serving people now, and we need to be in that space. The last thing that I think we need to do, and I'm busy giving researchers challenges, but I give activists, and I know there are activist researchers here, many of who I know as researchers, but I know you activists as well. People, students who are activists, we want to change the world, right? How can we use the information that's coming out here now to advocate for more social ownership? So for Labour, it's to say, interesting case study in terms of worker control and worker ownership in a factory. We see the problems. Are we going to go back and engage that union and say, is it possible to fix these problems? How can we fix these problems? To go to other companies that are also potentially closing and say, you know what, might not be the best ideal, right? We're not perfect now. But here's a very interesting example. Look at it, Ports for All. But you know what? It saved jobs. It's guaranteed incomes for workers. It set a foundation where the union remains active and strong. You can only grow unions if you're there. If everybody's retrenched, there's no space for a union. So the challenge equally for us is how do we use the very interesting work that you've done to build advocacy and activism on the shop floor so that it translates into tangible results in communities, in factories, and in the public policy space. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for really great challenges and insights. We've got a lot to do. So we have about 15 minutes left, and wanted to open a few questions to the floor. We do want to have a chance to respond, so maybe we'll take about 4 or 5 questions. So please raise your hands in the room and online, and we'll try and have a bit of a spread. Anyone in the room? You want to start us off? Yes, you will.
Thanks for the great work. My question relates to how you define paritables in relation to social ownership. Are you suggesting that cooperatives are an instrument for achieving social function?
Great, thank you. Anyone else in the room with a question? Yes.
Justin Clark, I can hear everyone. Back to the seminar call, just with the title. And I must confess, when I read the title, the political economy of social ownership, I thought it might have something to say about the sticky issue of who actually gets to participate in social ownership in the first place. And I think that's a key thing for us to consider in terms of moving forward with a sustainable model. Otherwise, it can, and I think one of the criticisms has been it has been used for great patronage networks, etc., etc. So that was an interesting angle I don't think you touched on. Then my second kind of question comment would be around, I mean, your key argument is to say that social forms of ownership can work, provided that the state plays a strong developmental role. So I wonder if there's a way for you to consider different case studies where there is a stronger or weaker state. So, for instance, in a local metro with higher skills, do you see evidence of it working? I think it's really important for us to start to think beyond just characterizing the different forms and definitions, but how do we move to a space where we know which sorts of ownership have a chance of working and what the state needs to do? Because I don't think that anyone wants a situation where it's actually just another form of state capture. We wanted a situation where it really is redistributed. So that's form of state intervention is important for us to understand exactly what it looks like and how it moves into the space which really achieves the original objective. So what kind of state do we need? Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to move over here so I can check it for online people. Go ahead.
That's fine. I don't want to keep here feeling that there is a difference or a matter of semantics between social ownership and solidarity economy. First, when I was presenting, you made mention of this different concept. The first question for me is, what's the difference between solidarity economy and social ownership? But two, concerned with the comment or the question from my brother next to me, who are the key actors when we talk about social ownership? What do we have in mind? I've had to talk about democratic participation, control, and all of those. Which, as I listen to you, those I don't want to say they are limited to the trade unions, and I also want to assume that we talk about social ownership. The key actors are the trade unions. Who are the key actors of the social ownership when we talk about this? What do we have in mind with the key role players?
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we don't have any further questions online that I can see. Online, people, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll try and come back to you maybe. But oh,
There's one hand. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, I didn't see that.
Silubonile.
Okay. Yes, Silubonile, would you like to go ahead? Can you mute yourself?
Yes, I'm not sure if I'm audible. Sorry, I'm at the library.
Yes,
So
we can hear you. Please go ahead.
I'm a lawyer and a businesswoman, right? And so my question then is, how do we ensure that the public is involved in such conversations and they are very much aware of how they can get portion of the land back, and it's not just like discourse with academics, people that like know where we are, and we take parliament and the different papers, white and the other one.
Sorry, Silubonile, we lost you for a little bit at the end. Could you just restate your last sentence?
What can we do as lawyers who have had privileges of working?
Okay. I'm so sorry,
I'm asking. Sorry.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what can we do to assist in ensuring that the public can.
Yeah. I'm so sorry, Silvonina, you keep cutting out. Would it be possible to type your question in the chat and then we'll read it out? Please.
We lost them.
Oh, she's gone. Okay. I'll write it in the chat box. Should we start responding? Quizzy, do you want to have a go at responding?
Does that come up there?
I don't mind, you can sit down.
Okay. No, thanks for the question, the comments. So let's deal with them in this fashion. So let's start with this one about the solidarity economy. So basically, there are a lot of debate about alternative economic development models, say political economy, in the 21st century. But some of the alternative models to neoliberalism or market fundamentalism are not based on like the classical socialism. So that's why you have things, models such as the solidarity economy, the well-being economy, eco-socialism, and others. So that term refers to a model. Now, within that model, you can have different forms of social ownership, if that makes sense. So there is a distinction. But what I'm trying to highlight with that, what we're trying to highlight in the paper is that social ownership is also important for changing the structure of the economy and the entire development model, if it's positioned with the criteria that we have. So that's the point that we're making there. The other issue is that there are different forms of social ownership, and what we've done is outlined a criteria of how to understand social ownership. And so cooperatives are a particular model. But I wanted to be careful here. Cooperatives can also be used to support different forms of economic structures, right? So you can use the cooperatives for pursuing eco-socialism. You can use the cooperative to support neoliberalism. And that's why in the paper, what we try to do is to qualify our description and our conception of the different models with this criteria and this continuum. Then the other issue around state capacity. So for me, the debate about state capacity is related to 2 points. So one is macroeconomic policy choices. So one of the reasons why we've had a decline in public service provision, for example, is because the state has had extensive outsourcing. We know there's even austerity. That has a direct impact on state capacity. So we can't separate the discussion about the ability of the state to basically deliver capacity from the macroeconomic policy choices that we make. And in my view, we need to consider that. And then the second point is that what is the role of the state? And what we're saying is that if you have socially owned models that are going to operate under free market principles and less state sort of support and intervention, you're not going to address the market failures that are impeding these models from growing or being sustainable. What are these market failures? Not having access to demand, for example. The fact that economies are concentrated. So in a way, you need a legitimate state with good capacity to address these market failures through industrial policy, competition policy, helping these socially owned models to even invest in R&D and even procurement. Then the issue about who are the actors, you see, it depends on the model. Because, of course, in a trade union or worker control, the actors there is clear, it's workers, right? In another model, you can have community members, and another, so there are different models, and that the model would determine the act. But politically, we want the actors or the key actors here are those who are mostly marginalized in the kind of capitalist framework, and they should be the one who should basically mostly benefit. And then the democratic participation point, just the last one here, is that this is one of the most contentious issues in socially owned models. So there's a book by Kate Phillips, Dr. Kate Phillips. She works in the presidency, but she used to work for the NUM. And she has an interesting book on the history of cooperatives in the NUM. Because the NUM basically started cooperatives in the 80s and 90s to try and sort of help workers that were unemployed. And one of the arguments she makes is that you can't have direct worker control or direct member participation because it's like impossible, it's inefficient, right? Whereas if you look at other models like the Brazilian and the Argentinian one, there the emphasis is that actually you need to have direct control. So this is one of the most contentious issues. But the underpinning sort of argument in the paper is that whatever model you go for, it must be transparent, it must be fair, it must allow participation, and it can't be nominal. So you have to allow people to have decision-making over substantive issues of how you run the socially owned organization.
Thanks, Kuzi. Katrina, do you want to comment on any of the other questions or feedback from the panelists?
Thanks. I can also read out Silubonile's comment. She says, my question is, what can we as activists who are lawyers ensure that these conversations on social equality are part of the land conversation? As we can't work without them because we are not addressing the inequality question. So maybe I think, if I'm understanding that question correctly, I think kind of land has played a really interesting role, particularly in agricultural co-ops, and kind of some of the agrarian reforms in the agricultural case studies that we look to, kind of ownership over land or having some kind of really secure land access and tenure and utilizing that in a cooperative way has been kind of the foundational element of the longevity and sustainability of these co-ops. So I think kind of bringing the land conversation into conversations even about socially owned renewables, of kind of who owns the land beneath renewables, is a really important and interesting conversation that we maybe haven't kind of thought about enough, but I think it's a really important point. And in terms of your broader point, I think it links to what Tanya has said, right? About how are we as academics engaging also as activists and with workers on the ground and trying to find ways to kind of have experiences, an interactive relationship between activists, scholars, the union movement, etc. But it's always something I think that we can improve on. I think maybe just one other comment on what Tanya has raised, and I think it's a really important point, is kind of there's a big hype around social ownership at the moment, particularly in the context of just transition, social ownership of renewable energy. But I think we can't, and it's one of the things that we try to do in this paper, is kind of remove that from a bigger politics around resistance to privatization, what is happening in the energy sector more broadly, and not let social ownership be used as a kind of almost like we'll privatize things, but here's a little concession because we have some social ownership models. And so it's about trying to connect, thinking about social ownership within a broader political economy of what's happening in the transition. And specifically to ensure that entities like Eskom, our SOEs, do not fall into the trap of essentially being privatized, and including through the kind of emphasis of the profit motive in our SOEs. So when we're thinking about how are we doing structures to have kind of the positive impacts of social ownership play out, it's also about looking at the ways in which they're being implemented, the kind of regulatory structures which are guiding the ways in which they operate, which I think also links to the issue around kind of state capture, accountability, transparency, etc. Yeah, so I think that's maybe all. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I wanted to just kind of respond to one of the points that was raised by Devin around profit and revenue. And I think it's a really interesting point. And I also grappled it, well, we grappled with it. We had lots of debates during the field work with, you know, because one of the core features of social ownership we're arguing is that the main priority is public benefits and not profit. So it doesn't mean that profit can't be one of the aims of the entity, but it's not the main aim. And I think another point is that you can have profit in an entity, but it's not being distributed to its shareholders. So you can have an entity which is not for profit, and you can still generate profits. You know, you can still have an entity that is selling goods or services and generating revenue, and that's above its expenses, which is what a profit is. And instead of distributing it to shareholders who are a small group who, you know, are somewhere else, you can invest that back into the organization or into your community. And I think that's, to me, what a public benefit organization, a not-for-profit entity is that, you know, you can still have profit. It doesn't take away the benefits and the kind of the fact that you're earning revenue, but it's how that revenue is then channeled, whether it's going to shareholders who can buy a boat, or if it's going back into the community or back into the organization to invest in sustainability and solidarity locally. And I just wanted to check if there's any other things, if we haven't answered any questions.
China made a point
Yes.
about building a model of margins and scale.
Oh, can you?
Yeah, so Tanya also made a point about the fact that what you don't want is social ownership to exist on the margins of the economy, because if it does, it's treated like that, but also it can be instrumentalized to support basically not transforming the main structure of the economy. So the way I see this is that you gotta sort of like tackle this issue or this conundrum on two legs, two fronts. The one is that you use socially owned models as a instrument of practice to show society that this is how you actually build alternative forms of ownership, of public interest and benefits. So people stop this idea that, oh, this is utopian, it can't be implemented. But at the same time, you link that to big questions on transforming the economy. So in other words, you build social ownership, but at the same time you say, we have to deconcentrate the economy in different ways. And here's a way of how, when you deconcentrate, it works. But what you mustn't do is that you mustn't build social ownership in order to support sort of like fortifying or like strengthening sort of this logic of concentration, liberalization, and financialization. And this is why even in the paper, we sort of try to tease out, and it might not be perfect now, the different role of the states and policy making. Because our view is that the state has to take a particular policy paradigm for social ownership to serve the purpose that time is spoken about. Yeah, that's one.
I think that's all we can do for today. So I'm so sorry if you have questions, you can come up with us afterwards. But we have reached our time, so I just wanted to say the thank yous. I don't forget anyone. Firstly, thank you so much to Katrina, Pauline, Kanimamba, Atinkosi, Kitso, and the whole SCIS team for all the support for organizing today's event. This is and I also wanted to thank again the AFD, the French Development Bank, and ANDA for the funding and feedback on the paper. We also want to say a huge thank you to Devin, Lindiwe, and Lebokang at the Presidential Climate Commission for all your support and feedback in developing this paper. Yeah, and lastly, a thank you to our speakers and panelists. Thank you so much for your inputs. We're kind of really excited that this is, you know, the beginning of a broader project of work, and we're keen to kind of work closely with you on kind of how the next steps pan out. And lastly, thank you so much to the participants and in person and online. Thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.